Hey everybody, DJ here. This is part 5 of the Epic Text tutorial series. And in this one, we're going to be going over how to render out and finalize your image for your portfolio. If you haven't yet, please take a moment to like and subscribe to this channel. It really helps me out. And let's go ahead and jump into Blender now. So basically in this one, you're going to see a couple differences in yours versus mine. I will have used a special way of doing the floor, which uses a very cool displacement technique that I will cover in a different tutorial. But for the most part, you should have something that looks pretty much like this, where we have a volumetric scene. Let me turn this off really quick. We have a volumetric scene with some lights that have been placed in here, and you have a really cool text composition. But you should have something that looks pretty much like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over kind of like some things to help you out on how to set certain samples and light paths. And then we're going to go into tile sizes, and I'll show you some really cool tips and tricks on how to actually preview your render to make this a little bit easier. So for a lot of you, you probably don't have the kind of setup that I have. I have a very high powered system, and there might be some lag in the render for your viewport over here. And before we really get any further, let me turn on the screencast keys for you. There we go. And basically, uh, for me, I have two GPUs that are pretty high powered, and you can see that it can render those samples fairly quickly. Let's help you out really quick over here in sampling. If you go to your render properties, go under sampling, change your viewport to something like, let's do 32. And if I turn on my overlays here and I reset this, you can see up here on the top left that there were some samples being done. And this is what it looks like with 32. So very, very grainy. And what we can do here is you can actually change the viewport to whatever you want. Let's say you change this to 128, hit enter, and you can see that it's going to render 128 samples. So if you change this to 0, it will actually keep doing renders over here until you either go to a different view, like solid mode here, or if you change this viewport amount, or if you move this area around a little bit. So this is a good way to sort of like preview how many samples you maybe should have. But for some of you, this might not be great because it might run your GPU or your CPU really, really hot and slow down everything else that you're doing. So that's one thing to keep in mind when you decide to change this. So I'm just going to change this back to 32. And if you find that this is very slow over here on the left, you might be using your CPU to render. So change this device here to GPU if you have one. And if you don't see that there, go to Edit, Preferences, go to System, and up here, if you have an NVIDIA card that's a discrete and one that's actually compatible with Blender, you should see it here. And using optics, if you can, this really helps out as well if you have a ray trace card. And then OpenCL if you have something like what I have, which are AMD cards. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that if you don't see any of this, that means that you're basically using your CPU to do rendering. And it can be very, very slow. So check those on for whatever the device is that you're using. If it's the CPU, if you want to use both CPU and GPU, I like to just use my GPU and use the CPU for other things there. Save that, and then make sure that you can select that device from the device list here. So that should help you out in, if you don't know anything about that and you're a fresh beginner, that should really help you out with your render speeds. The next thing that you'll want to do is sometimes it's just still very, very slow, and you want to see what the render is going to look like, and it's just, taking you forever for whatever the reason is. So one thing that you can do is you can actually change the render selection. And I showed you guys how to make it to where it just renders what's inside this frame here. And how that's done is if you go to your output properties, go to dimensions, and then click on this checkbox here that says render region. And that will just render what's in your camera. I'm in the camera view, by the way, over here. The next thing that you can do is I already have it checked on that says crop to render region. And what that does is if you select your camera whether it's in the selection tree up here in your collections or whether it's uh, on your viewport here. Once you have that selected, if you have crop to render region selected, you'll see these little sort of draggable corners. And you can click and drag that to certain areas to fix that. So what just happened is I have the screencast keys there, and it caused it to crash because it's constantly trying to refresh. So I'm going to keep it turned off for the moment, but I'm going to go back to this rendered view here and try that again. And you should not have that issue. Click and drag, and you can see that the area is now just this small section here. So if you're using screencast keys to make stuff, or you get that traceback issue and it crashes or something like that, it shouldn't happen to you. Just reopen. Make sure you save constantly. But that's basically how you do that. There is select your camera, go and make sure that you're in your camera view, and then click and drag these sections to whatever area. So if I want to just look at this area right here, you can zoom in down there and see what that will look like. And the great thing about this is you can actually render out your scene with this specific area selected. So if you want to do some test renders, but you don't want to render the whole frame, you can do this to test how many samples is going to work with your denoising and everything else that you're going to do. And then when you're ready for the final, you can click and drag them out to the full size like this and render out those areas. So when I'm working on my final renders, let me just close these down since I'm really not going to use these that much. Let me just close this down. When I'm working on my finals and I don't know how many samples I'm going to use, I will often do that where I will crop to a very specific area. Let's say this area with the D and this area up here. And I will just render out that area, see what the samples look like, and do my tests up there before I waste time. Because you don't want to waste time with your renders. You want to get it done as quickly as possible. So get a sample of either one area or two areas that show mostly what the scene's going to look like, and do your tests that way, and that will give you how many render samples. So let me change the viewport here again to 32. And I want to show you something really cool. We're not going to talk about this yet. We're going to talk about some of the viewport denoising. And this will help you out if you end up having a really hard time seeing your scene and you have trouble sort of visualizing what the final is going to look like. So what you can do here is if you click under denoise, click on viewport. And for me, it's the automatic, which for me uses the open image denoise since I don't have an NVIDIA card. But if let me just save real quick, go between these two and reset that, you can see that it automatically will denoise the image as it's rendering the scene out. And if I remove the overlays here, you can see that as it's going through the samples, it's denoising it so I can get a better idea about what this will look like when it's a little bit cleaner. And again, you can change this to a 0 and it will just keep rendering that area until you tell it to stop, or you change the settings as I said before. And if you turn back on your overlays, you can see how many samples are up here. So this might be something you want to try if you're trying to figure out how many samples. Maybe turn on the denoise. The only problem is that you're going to see these little speckles and stuff like that that's going to be in the scene, and that may not necessarily be there in the final render. So I'm going to turn that off now, just to save a little bit on the GPU there. So the next thing here is if we go over to adaptive sampling. Let's just talk about this really quick. If you ever get a chance, make sure that you watch my video on how to reduce time on your renders using cycles. I go through quite a few different ways that you can do this. They're not the only ways, but they're just some. Adaptive sampling basically says to the render engine, render this area until it reaches a certain amount of noise and then stop. And that's very good for, I would say, test renders and for ones that don't necessarily have this sort of volumetric look. The problem with volumetrics and using this sort of method to create your final image with the really cool misty effects, um, if you have even, this noise threshold set to this low number that I have here, I found out that you still have a little bit of an issue when it comes to denoising. So I actually wouldn't recommend doing adaptive sampling for this one, but you can sure, try different sets of noise threshold. Make sure that you change the size of the tile to, a smaller area to, check that area out and see what works for your scene. The next one here is light paths, and this is where you control your bounces. And I would say that for this one, if you click this little integrator presets right here, you can save new presets if you want, but I usually just use these and kind of change some of the numbers. I think for this one and for most of us, using the limited global illumination is just fine. And if you select that, it's going to change some of these values here. For volume, you can feel free to increase that sample if you'd like. But really, this I found works out pretty okay. Um, if you want a very, very realistic render and you don't want to have to do math and test to see how many paths actually work, you can go with the full global illumination, but just be aware that it will take you much longer to render than you're probably comfortable with. The next thing here is clamping. Just leave this as it is right now. I think you'll be perfectly fine with these set the way they are. And then when it comes to caustics down here, we don't really have any glass in the scene, so that's why these are probably not turned on or off or whatever. But if you want more of a realistic scene, usually this is best used for glass and things like that. I would just turn them on for now just to keep it standard across most of your renders. Volumes, we really don't need to worry about these. And just letting you guys know, I have it set to experimental for the displacement effect that I have on the ground here, which I'll show in a later uh, tutorial. But for you guys, you'll have it on the supported one, and that's completely fine. You shouldn't have any issues there. The other thing I want to talk about, if we go down to film, um, normally if you do not have a volumetric background, you'll want the background of your HDRI to be transparent, and you'll want to replace that with something else like black, or you might want to just put a different image back there. I have it checked on just from a previous render where the background was visible and I replaced it with some black or some gray or something like that. This doesn't really, if you have volumetrics on, this doesn't really do anything. So, you don't have to worry about that. Performance and tile sizes is a big area that people have a lot of questions and they're confused about. And I'm going to try and keep this as simple as I can. Number one, you'll want to go up here and go to Preferences, Add-ons, and there is an add-on that will actually help you with knowing or having some presets for you to make this a lot easier. So right here, it's called Render Auto Tile Size. So if you do a search for auto tile size or render colon auto tile size or just search for it, you should be able to find it. Check that on and save your presets. And basically what it does is it will, with this little gear attached or clicked on here, it will give you certain tile sizes. And generally speaking, when it comes to CPU, the smaller, often the better. For my particular CPU, 32 and 64 work very well. If it's a GPU, depending on how big your GPU is, I have very massive VRAM GPUs that can handle it, so I put them on 512 by 512. So it works out well for me, but for you, you might need to go 256 by 256, or at least select these. The next little checkbox here is it says calculate optimal size. So basically what this does is it takes this idea and it takes that into consideration. It goes, okay, you want them to be large, around 512 by 512. So what it does is it changes the tile size to fit a perfect amount inside the scene, so you don't get like half tiles being rendered, and it does a proper amount for the entire image instead of having some that are smaller tiles than others, that kind of thing. So it's just an easy way to basically render this out in a simplified method so that you don't have to do a lot of math and figure things out. So I do definitely recommend turning this on. If you are using the mix between, so if I go to system here and let's say I change this to my GPUs here. If you are using the CPU as well, so if you're going to use the CPU and GPU to do your render, which I do recommend if you have a lower powered system like a laptop, or you don't have a super high powered GPU or something like that, make sure that your render tile size in your settings here under the performance, set it to what your CPU will be. So if you're using a mix between CPU and GPU, set it to 32 by 32 or the 64. That way your CPU doesn't slow down your entire render. And I know that the Blender developers and everybody says that if you use the CPU and GPU in conjunction with each other, the tile size shouldn't have any difference and you should just be rendering faster. In my own tests, I have noticed that if I do GPU only at 512 by 512, it's faster than using all three of my devices together. I know that for my specific stuff, my hardware, but for you, it might be different. So, doing tests and all that it takes a long time, but it is worth it when it comes to trying to understand your system and how to quickly render out scenes. From there, I'm not really going to tell you to, you can try turning these on for save buffers and persistent images if you want. It helps with some final render stuff. You don't have to turn that on for your final render, so you don't necessarily need to turn this on, but let's go ahead and turn it on anyway. And that's pretty much going to be it for that. Now, the next thing has to do with kind of your color grade or the coloring of your particular image. So I'm going to turn off the overlays here just so you can see this and see what happens. What you want to make sure, and Blender's good with it now to where it always has this on, make sure that you change the view transform right here. Make sure the display device is sRGB, and that the view transform, make sure this is set to filmic. Standard is okay for certain things when you want to do a lot of coloring later, but for a lot of you guys who are doing this, you don't know a whole lot. I'm just assuming you probably do, and if you do, that's great. But you probably don't really know what lookup tables are and color profiles and things like that. So Filmic basically just helps you keep your colors, your blacks and your whites, and the other sort of colors that are in your image something more natural. And it's recommended strongly for people who are newer. So make sure that you set this to Filmic. Next thing down here is the lookup table. And we're going to be changing the contrast anyway. But you can feel free to, put some of these on medium, very high, things like that, just to see what it does to your scene. You can change this after the render, and it just does a kind of like a coloring effect over your film. But for now, I'm just going to set that to none. Okay. Now, for me, I set the samples for my final at 4112 or 4112. That's a lot of samples, and it was because I was trying to make a really, really high sample count for a very, very finely detailed image. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to set this to 2500 just to make it a little bit easier on the time and all that kind of stuff. The next thing that you're going to want to do, and the amount that you're going to do this is really up to you. And if you can swing it where you can do a 4K render like I'm doing here, where I set the resolution to the regular HD, which is 1920 by 1080, it's the size of most computer monitors and television sets. That's regular high definition. But when you want to have a final render in HD, or let's say 1920 by 1080 format, you want to render larger and then scale it down later. And the reason for that, it's kind of complicated, but basically if you render at a larger format and then you scale it down, you're increasing what's called the pixel density of your colors and the detail, and you end up with a lot sharper of an image. It's like if you took a photo of like a physical rendering, like a drawing or a painting, and then you took that photograph and you scaled it down to, like, let's say a stamp or a like a playing card size. You'll see that a lot more detail can be captured that way than if you actually drew it to the size of that stamp or the playing card. So it's kind of the same idea there. You get a lot more detail and a lot more pixel density when you do it that way. So I recommend that if you're like me and you're trying to go for a really nice portfolio piece or final that for a presentation, set it to at least, I would say 150%, which would be somewhere around 2K. And then you're going to, in the end, reduce the size down. Or what I did was I set it to 200%. And you're going to probably run into a little bit of an issues later when it comes to compositing, but I'll show you a way around some of those issues later. So that's really going to be up to you. You got to do a little bit of testing to see what your hardware can handle, what your CPU and your GPU can handle as far as rendering is concerned. One last thing before we decide to go to our final render, you want to go over to your view layer properties, open up the passes section. Then you're going to go to data and you're going to turn on this checkbox right here that says denoising data. This is going to allow us to take the information that's being rendered here and process it through a node that will save us overall a lot of time trying to get a clean image. And you'll basically be able to see a much nicer, much cleaner final than adding a whole bunch of other uh, samples. So at this point, you should have the amount of samples that you want to run because you've tested out a couple test frames or some test sections using this technique here, where you take the crop to render region and you just select those particular areas to render out. And you should have your light path set, and you can choose whatever you want here, but I went with the limited global illumination. And you should have your tiles set and everything else. So we are ready to do a final render. And I'm going to change this here to make sure it doesn't sample that small area. We're going to save. Then we're going to go up here to render. And you can either go up here to render image or hit F12 to start the render. And as this is running, I'm going to just talk really briefly about what's going on. And, for those of you who are relatively new and don't really understand how this works. So everything's being built here. And I have a particular displacement map that's going to make this a little bit longer to sort of like create. But basically, what's happening here is the two GPUs are set to those particular dimensions that we outlined. And if we zoom way in, you can basically see that those two tiles are rendering. And up here, you can see basically how long the last render was that it took, and I canceled the last one. That's why it says 10 seconds. You can see the current time. You can see the calculated remaining time for the final image, and you can see how much memory is being used and how many have been rendered, how many have been filtered for the denoising data that we set. So from this point here, I'm just going to leave the recording going and speed up the footage. And basically by the end, you should see a final image that's being uh, rendered. If you did decide to use your CPU, for every CPU and thread, and if you don't know what those are, you can check out my tutorial series, my primers on understanding your computer hardware. Basically, for every thread or every compute unit that's inside of your computer, you should see a little box or a tile for each of those sections being rendered for those parts of your render devices. Since I'm only using these two GPUs, that's why you see that. If I did have my CPU selected, you would see 48 boxes plus, because I have a 24 core, 48 thread CPU, and then you would see two more, and those would also be the GPUs that were being rendered as well. So let's go ahead and let this render out, and I'll see you in a little bit. Okay, so now the render's over, and hopefully you're still with me here, and you got yourself a snack while your uh, image was rendering out. Maybe got some nachos or something like that, and you should be left with something like this. And depending on the amount of samples, it will be more or less grainy. If I zoom in here, you can see that if I zoom way in, you can see the amount of grain, and as I zoom out, it gets a little bit less. YouTube will compress this, but hopefully you can see what I'm seeing, at least roughly. You can see we have a very nice, that volumetric light just kind of, kicking right through the middle there, and you get this really nice effect right in there. And again, the reason why my ground looks like this, where it looks like there's actually some depth going on, is because I used a displacement map in a particular way, which I will share with you guys in a later tutorial series, probably after this one, maybe next week, maybe this week, I'm not sure. depending on when you see this. But basically, this is what it is at 4K. And the final image is going to be a lot smaller, but you can still see that even if I zoom out a bit, you can see that there's some of that grain is still visible. And what we're going to do here is we're not going to close this because we actually want to keep it open for something else. But you can see up here, I just want to show you guys there's a slot 2, and there's a whole bunch of slots here. And basically what you can do is you can do a couple test renders and compare the two by hitting J or by selecting the different slots here and seeing what they look like. So keep in mind that currently how we're viewing this is the render result up here in this little drop down list. But let's go ahead and minimize this window, and we're going to jump into the compositing tab. Okay. And I'm going to show you how to do all this stuff from scratch. So don't worry about all of this stuff here. So what you should be seeing is probably nothing until you hit this thing right here that says use nodes. And I'm going to actually delete all of these and show you step by step how I created my final. So what you want to do is click on the use nodes here and make sure that you go to your options and click on OpenCL if you're using that as your render device. And you don't really need to change the chunk size here. I'm going to change it to 512 by 512. It's fine. You can mess with this if you want. But basically what we have here, and you'll see the background in the viewer, and make sure you have Node Wrangler turned on, Edit Preferences, turn on the Node Wrangler add-on, hit Control Shift left click, and we can look at our uh, image here in the previewer, and it's in the background. If it's too large, go to View, and then on the zoom here, you can even click on the viewer node right here, and you can click on the scaling like this in the background. Just make sure you have viewer selected right here. Or you can go up to view, and then where it says zoom right here, you can click and drag this up and down to fill up the frame as much or as little as you'd like. Now, it also helps. I have a dual monitor setup so you can't see what I'm doing on the other screen. But if we open up the Blender render screen here, you can change this if you click this drop down to the viewer node. And every change that we do here, so for example, if I look at the uh, this denoising normal right here on my other screen, I am seeing this. Okay. So basically mirroring what I'm seeing in the previewer. Now, you may not have a second screen, and that's totally fine. You can split your panels in here if you'd like to create that, but we're just going to use the backdrop here, or the image in the background, as our sort of like our preview render for the purposes of this tutorial. So what we have here is you have all of this stuff. Let me actually look at this through something else that's easier to look at. There we go. In this node over here, you're going to have a whole lot of different things here. And the only things that we're really interested in is the image, and that's also the noisy image, the denoising normal, and the denoising albedo. Okay, those are the three things that we're really interested in here. Now, one thing that you may be asking me about is why did we not do a depth of field with our camera? Well, sometimes it's usable and it's good. Sometimes you don't really need it. Adding a depth of field will kind of make this take quite a bit longer to get a clean render. And I think for most of us on this particular project, it does not need a denoise, or sorry, a defocus or depth of field on our camera settings. So you can check out some of my other tutorials on how to render your scene in, how to turn that on and how to do that. But for this particular project, I don't think it's necessary. So let's go ahead and go in here. And what we want to do is we want to start by denoising this so that we don't see all this craziness. So if you hit Shift A to add, we can go into Filter and go to Denoise. Okay. And you're going to want to take your image, pipe that into the image node here, the denoising normal, put that into the normal, and the denoising albedo, and pipe that right into there. And then we're going to view through the denoise with Control Shift left click, and now you have a nice denoised clean image. Okay. Now from this point here, I would recommend doing two things. Okay, and this will really help you out in the future. What you'll want to do in case something happens, let's say you have to leave and do something, or you are worried about something crashing or whatever it is, you'll want to save out some of these images now to make it easier. So I'm looking at this through the viewer node, and I'm going to go to image, save as, and I'm actually going to make a new folder here just for the purposes of this demo. And this will be demo render folder, but you should call it your render folder. Okay, you shouldn't leave everything just kind of loose and hanging around. So we're going to go inside the demo render folder. And what we're going to do here is we're going to save a comped or a pre-comped version of this image that will make things a lot easier. Now I'm going to go briefly through an idea on your file types. You have what's called lossy and lossless formats. Okay, a JPEG is a very small file, and it's what's called a lossy file type because you lose color information. A PNG is more of a lossless format because you get to retain a lot of color depth and lighting information that's normally not there. But what we're going to use is what's called OpenEXR. And these are very large. They use what's called a float, which means that there are a full float, which means that it's not just an integer value, which means 1, 2, 3. There is 1.0001 and so on. Basically, much more color information is stored within a RGBA full float lossless version. So we're actually not going to save this as a zip. We're going to save this as no codec. And what we're going to do is we're going to call this render denoised or denoised, whatever you want to do. And I'll call this version 1 or V1. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and save this as an image. Okay. So basically what we've done is we've made it to where, if you notice, if I go to the image here, and then if I go into denoise, you'll notice down here on the bottom right, it says compositing, and it took all that time to composite. So we've basically saved a denoised version of our image in an OpenEXR format, which has a lot of data stored within it. Okay. So if something were to happen where Blender crashes or your computer crashes or you're all of a sudden you lose power or anything like that, or you have to turn off your computer for some sort of update or whatever it is, you at least have that saved and you don't have to render your entire image again and then save out the image then. So this really helps you in saving time if anything like that were to happen. Okay. So how we view this, this new image that we've saved, is if you go to input and then you go to image, okay, then we're going to navigate to that image, okay. So basically, you just have that this new file here. You go in and you hit this little file button here, and you navigate to it. And if we view through it, you can see right there we have our denoised image, and it's able to read it just fine within Blender. Okay. Now I didn't save out the alpha and the depth. We could do that if we wanted to. You know, we can actually do this in here. So instead of putting it into the composite here, throw it into your viewer instead. So there, and then there. If you were saving out a animation, put it in the composite. But since we're using the viewer here, go ahead and throw it into there. Okay. So then we're going to go back to the rendering tab, change it to the viewer node. There we go right there. Go to image, save as, change this to OpenEXR again. And we're just going to save over this one here. So float full RGBA. We're going to change the codec to none. Click on this one right here because it's going to save over and hit save as image. And it'll be red because you're saving over. So save as image. All right. So let's go back over to compositing and move this stuff around. And we're actually going to deselect some of this stuff here because it's a little bit confusing with all these things everywhere. So if we look through here, there's the image there, the alpha, and then the depth we're really not going to worry about. So don't worry about this being black. Okay. So we're looking at the image here, and we're going to start to change a couple things about our image. So number one, what we want to do here is we want to do what's called a glare. And this is basically like a glow effect. And if we put that on there and we view through it, you'll see that we have all of these really neat looking little stars. Okay. And that's the sort of like standard default setting for the glare node. The thing is, if you have a very slow computer, this part is going to take a while to look at all this stuff. And that's why I showed you how to render this out here. Now, if you rendered out a JPEG or a PNG or even a TIFF, you may not see the kind of glare effect that I'm seeing here. And it's probably because it would be because you save that other format. OpenEXR allows a lot of versatility in being able to use the black and white channels and the color channels to pull more information. So make sure that you saved out that OpenEXR. Now, what we're going to do here is I'm going to show you two different things that you can do. Number one, I'm going to show you a basic glow. Okay, so if we go to glare, change it to fog glow, keep it on medium, and change the mix to a 1.0. So this is basically your glow channel. This is showing you what is actually being affected and the like how it's being layered over the top. A -1 in this mix setting here basically shows you your regular image, okay? If I go to 0, it's a mix between the two. So you have the glow effect that's put over the top of the image. So if we go to 1, sorry, yeah, 1, and we change this from size to 9, it's going to change the size of the glow to be kind of like edge out further away from the point of light that's being where the glow is being added. Okay, and if you change the size to a 2, the effect is that it is a smaller glow effect. So if we just set that to 9, just so I can show you guys how this looks, you have this more, um, you know, this just a bigger glow effect that's happening. And if you change this to a low set, it basically just has fewer samples and it's not as high quality. Okay. So when you do your final, make sure that you have it at a high setting. But if you're just previewing stuff, it's good to look at that through the low setting because you could see here how much longer that was taking to composite. Okay. So then when we have that set to, let's say the mix is at 1, so we're just seeing the glow channel. The setting here is at high. And now let's say that you wanted to see more. Let's just change this back to low here. Let's say you wanted to see more of this glow effect that, for some reason you weren't seeing a whole lot being affected. You want to change this threshold here to be lower. So if I go to a 0.2, you can see that a lot more of the scene is being affected to add that glare or glow effect. Okay. And if you notice that there's too much being affected, you can change this to a higher value. So let's say the threshold is at a 5. So now you can see that it's just grabbing some smaller areas that are just a higher value than the 1. Okay? Does that make sense? Basically, this threshold will grab more or less of the brightness channels in your scene to add that glow effect. And once you kind of have that set, I'm going to leave it at low right now. You can set that back to a 0, and the glow effect should be applied to the outside. Now, one thing that a lot of people really like, and I'm just going to hit Shift D here to duplicate the glare. What a lot of people really like, and if I view through this one again and I change the mix to a 1.0, a lot of people like what's called an anamorphic effect. And an anamorphic effect is something like, let's look up really quick here just to show you an example. One of my favorite movies of all time is The Thing by John Carpenter. But if you look up The Thing, Dean Cundey, Dean Cundey was the DP. And if we go to images here, you can see some like images that he shot and all that kind of stuff. And basically, what the anamorphic effect is, and if you look up Dean Cundey, by the way, he has a lot of great things on his list of movies that you loved as a child and you still love. If you look up this right here, you see this effect where this streak goes all the way across the frame. That's basically because a anamorphic is basically like the film is kind of like stretched across, and it will take the glare or the glow effects or the dust on the lens or lens flare or anything like that, and it will stretch it across the screen to get these really, really, really neat effects. So here's an example with the ring here. Um, and if we look at, let's see, this one right here, you can see that effect going right across Kurt Russell's face here. I think this is right before he fights the big thing in the cavern. So that kind of effect where the light is sort of dragged across the frame is what a lot of people really like, and I'm going to show you how you can kind of replicate that here. So if we go in here and change it from fog glow to streaks, you can start to see this sort of effect here, and you're like, okay, well that sucks. That looks nothing like it. What's going on there? Um, what we're going to do is we're going to take this, and instead of 4 streaks, take this down to 2. Okay, and you can see now you're starting to see where I'm at, okay? So that's the left and the right. If you go down to 1, you can see it's only the left side. If you do streaks at 2, it's the left and the right side are kind of being dragged across the frame there. Then what you'll want to do here is bump your iterations up. So instead of 3, bump this up to 5. And that will basically make it a lot more gradual, the effect, as it's being dragged across. Then you have this setting here called fade. So set this to like a 0.98 or something like that. And you'll see now it's being dragged all the way across the frame. Let's move this up a little bit here and move this over. So you can see that that's now being dragged all the way across the frame with this really like funky effect, okay? And we have it set, if I take this down here, it's set to low, but if I change it to high, and remember, I have a really fast computer and it still takes some time to composite, so you might have to be a little bit patient here as you're working with this. You can see there, when you set it to high, it's a lot more sort of like tighter, and the way that it's done is a little bit cleaner. And you can take this and change it to like a point 989, a point 999, something like that, and you can start to basically stretch this across the frame as much as you want. So if I take this to a 0.995, let's see how much that does. Something like that, okay? So you can start to see this pretty funky effect happening here, okay? Now, sometimes what I'll do is I'll actually use a low setting if it seems to work out for my composite, but high is going to usually get you a better sort of like look, okay? Then there's the color modulation here, okay? So if I pull this out and you see there's a color modulation, this basically will change the coloring effect as it's dragged across. So if I change that to like a 0.750 or something like that, wait for it to composite, you should see a change. So you can see the color is sort of changing over the streak that's happening here. Okay, so that may or may not be what you want. You can set this to like a 0.1 or something like that, just to kind of get something more along the lines of what you're really looking for. So there we go. It's a lot cleaner as it's like sort of streaking across there. Okay. Now, in order to get this a little bit better, and you can change the threshold as much as you'd like. You can even do an angle offset. So let's say I want to do a 25-degree offset here, and I'm going to change this to low just so you can see what that looks like. You can see that you can make some sort of funky effect like that. I was actually watching a movie the other day that had these done. I can't remember what it was. I want to say it was a classic film, and I'm sad that I forgot, but I'm pretty sure that it had something like this effect that was layered over the top for this sort of like glowing lens flare sort of look. But I'm going to set this back to 0. I'm going to set this back to high, and I'm going to change the mix here to a 0, and we're going to see what that looks like in the composite. So you can see that once I've sort of set that, it's a little bit kind of like strong. It's really hard to see what's going on, and this is basically where you can play with your threshold, and you can play with the mix here. Make it a negative zero point 0.5 if you want. Change that up to get that where you want it to be, and I'm going to speed up this part just so you can see how I would sort of approach this in a real life scenario. So here I have this sort of look right here. So it's kind of doing that effect. And one thing that we can do here is we can actually change this out so that we can actually blur how this is acting here. Because you can see it's very, very sharp, these lines. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually change the mix here. So if we take this, take the mix, change it to a 1, and I'm going to turn this on low so you can see what's going on. So you can see that it's basically these lines that go all the way across, right? So if we go here and we add filter blur, and then take this, pipe that into the image, look through the blur, And then here for up and down, yeah, that should be Y. Let's see here. Yeah, so X is going to be left and right, Y is going to be up and down. So let's try a 30. And so that's going to sort of soften that up a little bit. And if we change this, and you could change some of these effects here if you want, but I wouldn't really recommend it, at least to start off with. Just sort of follow along with me. I'm changing the streaks to high now, which should sort of create the edging effect that we saw before, something like that. So then what we can do here is we can actually mix this over the top of our original image. So if I zoom out, I'm actually going to use this glare as the image node that we're going to use since it has this really nice little shine effect here. We're going to kind of add these together. So Shift A to add, color, mix, plop that right down in here. We're going to take these and make sure that we're actually going to move this around a little bit. So how these composite nodes work for the mix color, and this is the same way uh, in your node editor, it takes the bottom and it puts it over the top with whatever this operation is right here. And what we want to do is we want to take the bottom and we're actually going to want to either screen it or add it over the top. Okay, so we're going to change that to screen. And here is what we have. And you're like, okay, this looks terrible. So what we're seeing here is we're seeing that these are values that are beyond what is pretty much like what we can rationally see, okay? And you're getting errors like this. We can actually fix that by doing the following. If I go Shift A, color, and I'm going to do this in a very simple way. I'm going to use a mix node here, put the factor to 0, okay? And we're going to just view through here so you can see what's going on. If I take this and I move this all the way up to 1, it's white, okay? All the way to the left, we're just seeing this. Then you're going to click this right here that says clamp. And we're going to clamp the colors from 0 to 1. And did you see what just happened there? I mean, you might not be able to see it on YouTube, but I can see it because I have high dynamic range monitors. The whites got clamped. So if I remove that, these should be a little bit brighter. And if I click the clamp on, there is a change in that brightness value. Okay. So I'm clamping the actual brightness values from to a 0 and a 1, okay, which is what we actually are going to need to make sure we do before the final image is rendered, or at least it's what the final image format should be like, okay? So the next thing we're going to do, we're going to take a look through here. And you can see that it's now being put over the top without those weird errors that are happening, except for this right here. We might just take this, duplicate it, throw it right there, and then see how that does. And then take the factor and change this down to whatever it is that you want. So I just set it to a 0.01. And maybe let's try a 0.05 because it's barely there. You can kind of see it, but kind of can't. And there you can see the streaks that are playing over the top. So, not everyone is going to like that effect. This is more of a way to show you guys how you can add those streaks if you want and play around with that and add it if you'd like. That's basically how it's done. And then adding the blur and all that kind of stuff, I'm going to make it just sort of a little bit more subtle. Maybe even 0.0, let's try 0.5. Just a little, just a touch of it over the top there. And so that kind of has a little bit of an effect right there. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to add a distort. So distort, lens distortion, throw it in right here. And what we're going to do is click on this right here that says fit. And basically what we're doing is we're adding a little bit of a lens distortion to the image to make it look a little bit more realistic, like it's shot with a real camera. The distort, we're going to put a 0.005, so that'll add a little bit of a distortion effect around the bottom here, which you'll see right about now. So there's just a little bit of a distortion there. And then for the dispersion, that's basically at the edges and some of the brights in the image. It adds a little bit of a dispersion effect. Um, and you can see sort of like the red, blue, and green channels being sort of like separated from each other. So we're going to put this at a 0.01 and see how that does. And so that basically added just a slight bit of dispersion. I'll open up the larger version of this here and zoom in just so you can see it. You should see a little bit of a change in the red and blue and green values right through here, especially right here. There's a sort of like a prismatic effect that happens. It just adds a slight bit of realism to the actual overall image. And that's really all it's for, is just adding just a very slight bit of realism to it. If we zoom way in here, you can see that there should be, or at least you should see, a blue, a green, and a red being separated from each other. And that's what the dispersion effect does. And when you zoom way out, it doesn't have that huge of an impact and it's not as obvious. But if you were to look at this with and without the distortion, you should be able to see quite a little bit of difference. And it does add a little bit more realism to your image. Now, the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to add, we're going to do some color correction, but we're actually going to save this out as a pre-comp, okay? So we're going to go back into where our, the window that showed up when we hit the render image button. You can either do that in here or go into rendering, the rendering tab at the top. Make sure this is set to the viewer node that we've been looking through. Go to image, save as, and at this point you can save it as a PNG if you'd like. I'm going to keep it as an OpenEXR just to make sure I don't lose anything. And what we're going to call this is render pre-comp, actually pre-color. Let's call it pre-color, okay? So we're going to do a like a pre-comp render, but we're going to call this render pre-color version 1, okay? And it's RGBA, float full, same thing as we did before with the OpenEXR, and save that image. Head back to the compositing tab, and now what we're going to do is I'm going to duplicate the this image button here, or the image node that I created, and I'm going to just navigate to our pre-color image. And now we're going to go in here to add color, and we're going to take a RGB curves, and we're going to take the image map, or the image input here, or output, I should say, put that into the image input and view through there. So this part is a little bit difficult for some people to get, and I'm just going to give you some quick pointers, and I'm not going to go as in detail as I do in some other tutorials on this. You should be using the RGB curves, the color correction, and or a mixture between these. You don't have to use all of these together, but you know, at least one and some of them. And let's also use the, where is it, color balance. Okay. And since we've saved out a pre-comp image here, it's going to make this part a lot easier for us. And I'm going to tell you, all right, I guess I should show you by doing this here. And let's go to image editor. So we'll have to open up the image editor. You can do this here as well. You can change this up here to the image editor. We're going to navigate to the viewer node. So click up here, type in viewer node. Then, and you'll have to forgive me because I'm using this small screen here, or just my one screen that I'm not used to. I'm going to hit N to open up these tools here. And you'll see this tab right here called Scopes. And you'll want to look at the thing that says waveform right here. And our goal is to try and get these in between 100 and basically not have anything peaking at this 100 value up here and way down here at 0. Now you can see here, if you can see the waveform monitor clearly, we don't have anything that goes above 80. And pretty much the reason for that, if we view through our previous image here, so if I look on the left side, I'm going to collapse that right here. I'm looking at our render denoise that we exported. Look at all these values that go up there, okay? So when we clamped the value here in our mix node and we clamped that value, look, boom, okay? So that means that those whites up here in the top, those whites are blown out, okay? So we don't get any detail there. And if I zoom way in, you can see there's no detail. But that's okay, because really we don't want detail there. At least that's how I made this. I wanted to blow that out because I wanted that to be extra shiny, okay? And you can use a color correct to fix that to make it to where those whites aren't way up there, but I'm not going to do all that for this particular tutorial. I'm just trying to explain to you how this works. So if we go down here and we view through this image that we exported, and we go to the RGB curves, we can now, and we're going to click on the film-like one here, this button here. You can add by left-clicking and dragging an S-curve to basically control the contrast of your image. And if we zoom out here, and this is a little bit small, but on the left here, I'm just looking at the RGB curves node. And if you look here, this is our preview for our final image that we're color correcting. We can control the contrast using this S curve. Okay, so the deeper we pull this up to the top left, the darker it's going to push some of those values. And you can see over here on the waveform monitor how that's working. If we pull this down over here, it sort of brightens it up a bit. And if we pull it up here, it creates more contrast, okay? And same thing down here. If we pull this down to the bottom right, it's getting more contrasted. Pull it up to the left, we're sort of washing it out with a more bright sort of look to the whole thing, okay? So it's up to you on how you want to color this. There's what's called high key and low key and all kinds of other ways to tone your image. It's really up to you, but you can see there that because these whites were blown out, there's not a whole lot I can do to bring those whites back. Even if I pull this way down over here, you can see there's only so much detail that's still in those white areas, okay? So you got to be very careful when you save out some of your images that you don't blow out those whites too much. And sometimes you'll actually have to go back and switch out your lighting and change how you've done your lighting to make it a little bit easier to see that kind of detail and then make your coloring adjustments here. So basically what I want to do is I want to bring some of these dark values down to the bottom here so that there's a nice black value, a nice darker value, but not too dark. And then I wanted to pull some of these brights up this way a little bit, maybe something like this. And now let's collapse this a little bit. Color correction is basically doing a lot of the same thing with the curves, except for curves is more of a dynamic way to control some of these. But in here, you can change the saturation. So if I take a look here, and I take the saturation for the master here and I put it down to a 0.5, you can see that the whole thing becomes desaturated. And then if I take the shadows and I put the shadows at a 0, you can see how that's toning the image. Maybe put that to a 0.75 so that the greens and the blues sort of pop out a little bit more. And if you take the midtones here, set it to a 0.5 or something, you can see how that is handled there. Maybe 0.85, sort of pulling some of the really deep colors there and sort of graying those out, making them less vivid if that's what you want to do. I'm going to set that back to a 1, maybe a 0.95, maybe a little bit less, just to soften that up a little bit. Gamma, gain, and lift, you can feel free to mess with those, but I think those are better used over here with the color balance. So I'm going to jump over to color balance here, and basically these three sliders, you pull them up or pull them down. And when you hover over it, it says what it does here. Lift is a correction for shadows, so you can pull these down or pull them up. And if you look at the waveform monitor, which hopefully you've been checking between the left and the right here, and you can go back and take a look and rewind and just take a look at the section again. If you take these and you pull them up and down, you're basically stretching the overall coloring down to the bottom so that you're getting more shadows in there. Or if you pull it up, you're taking the shadows and you're lifting those up. Okay, so that's the lift there. Let's do something like that. And then right here it says gamma, correction for the midtones. So if you click and drag this up and down, You can change the midtones if you'd like to sort of gray out a certain area, maybe keep the darks really dark and keep the midtones a little bit lighter. And then over here on the right, as you probably guessed, the gain here is for the correction of the highlights. So you can pull those up, you can pull them down. If you want to give a little bit more highlights to see the reflection here or the way that your volumetrics are cascading off, you can do that there, or you can pull them back by doing something like this. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. So we can kind of mess with these a little bit. And one of the more fun things you can do with this, with the color balance, is you can do an overall tone shift in coloring your film. And what I mean by that is if you go over here and if you hold shift and you left click and drag in one direction, whether it's down over here to the red or whatever it is, you can start to color those specific areas. So right now I'm coloring the darks, and let's say I wanted to cool this down, and by cooling it down, I mean use a blue color. I want to cool that down a little bit with like a little bit of blue. Okay. And maybe for the midtones here, you wanted to do something a little bit funky and add a little bit of red to it, or shift it to a green or a yellow or something like that. You can color your image by doing this. Or if it seems like it's a little bit off and you need to cool it down because it feels too warm, or if it feels too cool and you want to warm it up, you can add blue or take away blue or add red or add yellow, whatever is going to sort of make the image look more like what you kind of want it to be. So, for example, here, after I change the shadows and the midtones, the highlights look a little bit too cool. Overall, the image is a little bit too cool in an overall tone. So if I take the highlights here and I left click and drag, pull it down and make it more warm, let's say something more like this, I can change the tone of this lighting effect here. Make it more something like that. Okay? Now, obviously, this is really up to you on how much you want to play with this. So here's a before that color balance. Okay? And then here's an after. So you can see that there's quite a bit of a dynamic change there. And it's really going to be up to you to play with these and to get these to a way that you really like. The general rule of thumb, I would say, is to make sure that you're rendering out different stages of your comp, especially if you don't have a high powered system, because it could take you a long time to composite all these nodes when they're sort of piggybacked right on top of each other. Okay? The next thing is make sure that you get a good contrast with your RGB curves. So this was a little bit washed out. Okay. So using the RGB curves, we added some more contrast to make it more of a dynamic image. Then we used I used the color correction to sort of shift some of the master, or I didn't do the master saturation. Maybe we could pull this down to a 0.85 or something like that if we wanted to, but I think this was fine what it was at. To pull the saturation of the midtones and the shadows down a little bit, maybe even take these down a little bit more, something like that. Then over here with the color balance, we just sort of popped up some of those colors a little bit, make some of it feel a little bit cooler while the lighting is a little bit warmer. But really, that's going to depend on what kind of image or overall feeling you want to portray with your particular image. The last thing you need to do here is once you're done with all of this stuff, make sure that you go into here, whether it's looking at it through this rendering tab here and then saving it from the viewer node, or you can even do it in here where I have set this up. Go to image, save as, and make sure to save this out as first a PNG, 8-bit color depth, 0 compression. Okay, so and we will call this render comp. Okay, save that. The last step that you would need to do is pull this into either GIMP or into Photoshop and do a really quick resize. Maybe one day I'll do a quick tutorial on how to do that inside of GIMP so everybody can do it, but really it's very straightforward. You should be able to do it just fine without me showing you. Download GIMP, do an overall scaling down 50%, and then save that out as a JPEG to share with friends online, or save it out as a PNG and or print it up or whatever it is that you want to do with it to have your final image. So that's going to be it for this whole series. So hopefully you're able to stick with me and get a really neat, nice image after all this is said and done. And you'll be able to do this for other clients or for more projects for yourself, whatever it is that you're looking to do by creating images like this or using text. And again, please be sure to subscribe and like the channel and this video. It really helps me out. And I will see you guys next time on DJ Tutorials.